So in this video, we're going to look at the Federal Reserve's bank balance sheet. But before we look at the balance sheet, how this T account look like, the liability and assets, we need to look at what are the three players on this money supply process, in the money supply process. So which means the interaction of the three players will help us to understand how the money comes from. So what are the three players? So the three players, including the central bank, like in the United States, it will be the Federal Reserve, and the banks, like commercial bank, PNC Bank, the Bank of America, and the depositors. So the central bank actually is the government agency. So we learned from the chapter 13, what is our Federal Reserve play a role in U.S. economy? So they are oversee the banking system and is responsible for the conduct of money policies. And in the United States, the Federal Reserve is the central bank. So for the banks, is financial intermediaries that accept the deposit from individuals and institutions that make loans. So like commercial banks, saving and loan associations, mutual saving banks, and the credit union. So they are considered as the second player banks. And the third player is called depositor. So usually it means individuals and an institution that hold a deposit in banks. So you are not the only one can be considered depositors. So some big businesses, they make actual money, they put the money as a saving, put it as a deposit in the bank. So they also consider as depositors. And so of the three players, the central bank is the most important. The Fed conducts monetary policy, involved actions that affect its balance sheet, and to which we turn now. And so after we understand the three major players, now we're going to focus on our Fed. As I said, the Federal Reserve is the most important player. So how their T accounts look like. So which means what are their assets and what are their liabilities. And so for the Federal Reserve, so their Federal Reserve System T account for the asset item, asset including the securities, a loan to the finance institutions. So the liability is currency in circulation and the reserve. So before we look at those four items under two column in detail, first we're going to explain what is liability and what is asset. And so the liability means I own. The liability means you own somebody something. So you own somebody something, and so the two. So therefore, why the currencies and the reserve are considered as the Federal Reserve owns somebody something. So first of all, think about the currency. So the currency is issued by the Federal Reserve, right? The issued by the Federal Reserve. So that a $1 bill you see on the first slide of this chapter. So the currency in circulation is the amount of currency in the hand of the public. And so the currency held by the depository institution is also a liability of the Fed, but it's counted as part of the reserve. So the Federal Reserve note, as I said, is also called IOU from the Fed to the bearer and are also liability. But unlikely most liability, they promise to pay back the bearer solely with the Federal Reserve notes. So that is, they pay off IOUs with the other IOUs. So accordingly, if you bring a $100 bill to the Federal Reserve and demand payment, you will receive two $50, $5 $20, $10 $100 bills, or some other combination of the bills that aids to $100. So people are more willing to accept IOUs from the Fed than from you or me because the Federal Reserve notes are recognized the medium of the exchange, as we mentioned about what is money before. So that is, they are accepted as a measure of the payment and so function as money. And unfortunately, neither you nor I can convince people that our IOUs are on anything more than the paper that are written on. So therefore, the Federal Reserve is more credible than us. And so therefore, you can see that this $100 bill or that $1 bill, that means the Federal Reserve owning your money. Therefore, they become the liability. So why the reserve is also considered as a liability. So what is the reserve? So the reserves consist of the deposit at the Fed plus currency that is physically held by bank. So basically, that is the money the commercial bank, the second player, the banks, they they put that is part of the money the Federal Reserve own the banks. Therefore, the reserve become part of the liability. And so the total reserve. So the total reserve can be divided into two categories. So it's the first is the reserve that the Fed require banks to hold, called required reserve, and any additional reserve the bank chose to hold, called excess reserve. So for instance, the Fed might require that for every dollar of the deposit at a depository institution, certain fraction less than 10 cents must be held as reserve. So the fraction will be 10%. That is called the 10% is also called the required reserve ratio. So the required reserve ratio. So you can see the currency is the money or the portion that or the item that Federal Reserve owns from the depositors, and the reserve is the Fed owns from the commercial banks. And so these are the liability for the Federal Reserve. How about assets? So what kind of assets are owned by the Federal Reserve? Basically, those the reason we consider as asset is somebody owned from the Fed, or the Fed holding it as solitary value holding item in the bank account. So there is two things considered as asset: security and the loans to the financial institution. So why those are considered as somebody else owned from the Fed? First of all, think about security. So security. The security is issued by the commercial banks. So the issued by the commercial banks. So the the security is issued by the U.S. Treasury, and in unusual circumstances, such as if we have coronavirus, so those will be considered as part of the Treasury can issue the security and sell to the Federal Reserve. So what does that mean? That means the Federal Reserve holding the security, and eventually they will be paid back by the treasuries. So therefore, this become part of the Federal Reserve's asset. And so an increase in the government or other security held by the Fed leads to an increase in the money supply. We can explain later why. And so the loan to the financial institution. So this is easier to understand. So basically, the Fed borrowed money to the financial institution. So therefore, the financial institution own the Fed. Therefore, this is the asset. This is a part of the item owned by the Federal Reserve. And so the commercial banks, the other financial institution borrow the money from the Fed. Therefore, this become part of the Federal Reserve system's asset. Federal Reserve's asset. So during the normal times, the Fed makes loan only to banking institution, and the interest rate charged to bank for those loans is called a discount rate. So they don't call it interest rate. They give a fancy name called discount rate. So this is the interest rate the Federal Reserve charged to the commercial financial institution that borrow the money from the Fed. So that rate is not called interest rate; it's called discount rate. So they just try to distinguish this kind of special loan from other commercial loans. So if the commercial bank borrow money from the Fed, so the interest rate being charged is called a discount rate. So those are important concepts you have to understand. So after we understand the T balance, so in our next video, we're going to look at is how the Federal Reserve control our money base, and how we use the understanding of the money base to understand the money supply in the whole system.